World War II. It was the good war. The opposing factions, Allied and Axis, were defined by the men who led. Men who have become archetypes of good and evil. These men defined the conflict, rallied their countrymen, demanded loyalty, and hungered for victory. But if the leaders defined the war, it was the regular citizens who fought to defend their country, ordinary men and women who rose to extraordinary heights in the midst of battle. But the memories of World War II were rapidly fading, along with the men and women who lived and fought during this momentous period. Through their stories, we must preserve the valor and courage of the soldier, sailor, marine, and airman who fought this good war. For they are the heroes of World War II. The youngest men and women who fought in World War II now are entering their late 70s. As they grow older, their numbers diminish, and with them the valiant stories of their heroic deeds in the war. It's important to record and acknowledge their role in that historic fight for freedom and democracy. These men and women can be a great source of inspiration for us now and for generations to come as they share their tales of bravery, camaraderie, and humor. It was the general belief that the United States would be drawn into World War II because of the conflict in Europe. Adolf Hitler emerged from the political and economic ruin of Germany as its Führer, or leader. In calculated steps, he dismantled the constraints of the Treaty of Versailles, which the Germans felt had so seriously crippled them after World War I. He began by reclaiming lands Germany lost because of the treaty. He forced a vote and regained the coal-rich Saar region. After that victory, he marched his troops into the Rhineland with little resistance internally or internationally. He then turned his attention to Austria. Cheering crowds greeted the Nazi soldiers as they marched into Austria. Next, he set his sights on Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland that bordered Germany to the east had a large German population. Plus, it provided the Nazis access to their enemy, Russia. Hitler knew that a string of intertwining pacts between Czechoslovakia, France, and Britain meant an attack on Czechoslovakia would force France to uphold their treaty and defend Czechoslovakia. Hitler looked forward to a rematch with his World War I foes, now that he possessed superior military strength. Instead of war, Hitler got negotiations. Italy, France, Germany, and Britain signed the ill-fated Munich Agreement. Upon his return to England, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain uttered his famously inaccurate statement about peace in our time.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
In less than a year's time, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement when his army invaded Poland. This time he got his wish. France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. In quick succession, Germany invaded Norway and Denmark, and then marched on and through Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and France. The victorious German army marched through the streets of Paris. A grand symbolic gesture, Hitler forced the French government to sign their surrender in the same railroad car that Germany had signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1918. Hitler then used France to launch his attack on Britain. For 57 nights, the Germans bombed Britain with more than 200 planes a night. Almost 40,000 civilians perished in the Blitz. Even though the British were outnumbered in aircraft, they were able to overcome the German onslaught with a mixture of strategy, technology, and most importantly, courage. The German occupation of France and the bombing of Britain placed the United States in a vulnerable position. What if Britain was to fall? Although America was officially neutral, President Roosevelt persuaded Congress to release money for national defense. The word on everyone's lips was preparedness. The German bombings left Britain on the verge of bankruptcy. Winston Churchill asked Roosevelt for help. Searching for a way to skirt the neutrality laws, Roosevelt found an obscure law that allowed the Secretary of War to lease equipment not required by the U.S. military. But Roosevelt had to sell the notion to the American public. He posed this question to Americans. If your neighbor's house caught fire and he had no garden hose, the prudent thing to do in order to prevent the fire from spreading is to lend him your hose. This question convinced the American public that Britain's survival meant America's security. When that Lend-Lease Act was initiated, America set itself to the task of being the great arsenal of democracy. There was no question that the United States would enter the war in Europe. It was just a matter of time. But Hitler and Mussolini weren't the only threat to freedom and democracy. In the Pacific, another menace began to emerge: Japan. In the Pacific, Japan had begun its conquest for land with more natural resources. It began by building up its military strength, increasing its troop numbers and producing military weapons. In 1937, Japan turned to its neighbor China and invaded. Japanese forces captured the major cities of Shanghai and Nanking. This forced Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the National Party, to retreat further into the interior of China at Hankow. The military aid China received from the United States and Britain helped thwart the Japanese attack. The Japanese did not plan on the strong resistance from the Chinese, who inflicted heavy losses. Not wanting to expend its military resources on a prolonged war with China, Japan decided to isolate China from outside support. Closing the seaports of China was easy, since the Japanese Navy now was stronger in the Pacific than the combined forces of Britain and the United States. But two supply routes still remained: the rail line from Haiphong Harbor in French Indochina, now Vietnam, and a dangerous twisting road in British-controlled Burma, which is now Myanmar. In 1939, Southeast Asia was under the control of three colonial powers: Britain, France, and Holland. Japan exploited the war in Europe to occupy air bases in French Indochina. It threatened Britain with war if the Burma supply route remained opened. Churchill could not afford a two-front war. He closed the road. The Japanese success in closing down China gave birth to an ambitious plan to wage an all-out attack on East Asia. Their objective was exclusive control over all raw materials in the Pacific and domination of the people of Asia. In July 1941, the Japanese occupied all of French Indochina and obtained enough air and naval bases to launch attacks on Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. In a further act of aggression, the Japanese sought to neutralize the United States by a series of diplomatic moves. It signed the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo Axis with Germany. This pact obliged Japan to enter the war if the United States joined Great Britain in the war. Or the reverse, if Japan declared war on the United States, Germany would also declare America its enemy. Japan then signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. By doing so, Japan made it clear that it only had one enemy in Asia, the United States. Japan's plan to frighten the United States into submission backfired. Roosevelt let it be known that the United States would take, quote, any and all steps necessary, unquote, to oppose Japanese aggression. One step froze all Japanese assets in the United States. The second step banned all trade with Japan. This meant these two integral materials, steel and oil, were no longer available for their war machine. In 1941, the moderate prime minister was replaced by General Hideki Tojo. General Tojo thought the American oil embargo left Japan with two choices: either give in to the United States' demands and pull out of China, or go to war. The new prime minister decided to go to war. The oil embargo left Japan with only 14 months of supplies left, so they had to act quickly and decisively. Their plan was twofold. First, make a simultaneous attack against the centers of power in Asia: Singapore, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam. Second, destroy or cripple the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor using aircraft carriers. This would prevent an immediate attack from the United States. The war in Europe gave Japan more confidence in their plan. It looked like Hitler would defeat the Russians as early as December 1941. While Japan readied their plan, diplomatic negotiations continued with the United States. But those negotiations were little more than a diplomatic exercise. Both sides prepared for the inevitable. The United States had broken the secret Japanese diplomatic military code. All indications pointed to war, but when and where were not clear. On December 6th, Japanese ambassadors delivered the first part of a diplomatic note to the Secretary of State in Washington, Cordell Hull. This note contained Japanese demands for peace. Let Japan determine China's future and withdraw all U.S. forces from China and Indochina. The second part of the note, which broke relations with the United States, arrived from Japan on the morning of the 7th. War was to be declared that afternoon, but the note was delivered late. The attack already had begun.
We had had a hunch that we might be attacked, but not at Hawaii. Talks had not gone well in Washington, and we thought perhaps there would be an attack in one of the outlying islands, Philippines perhaps.
The United States was in the middle of two world aggressors, Japan and Germany. Political and military advisors thought that if the Japanese were to attack, the target would be one of our bases in the Philippines. Meanwhile, the immediate threat seemed to be in Europe. Hitler's army seemed invincible. So while our watchful eyes focused on Europe, the Japanese set their plan in motion. Pearl Harbor on Oahu Island was home of the United States Pacific Fleet and more than 50,000 American troops. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 7 battleships were anchored east of Ford Island, creating Battleship Row. To the west, light cruisers and seaplane tenders. To the north were the destroyers, 20 strong, accompanied by 2 tenders. Off Pearl City were minesweepers and mine layers. In the Navy Yard across from Battleship Row were a variety of vessels in dry dock, including the battleship Pennsylvania.
On the morning of December the 7th, most everybody was either asleep or lounging around on their beds back in their cruise quarter where I was.
A buddy of mine had gone ashore, and we were late getting back to the ship. And usually we were up earlier than what we were, but we kind of slept in a little bit.
And I was still in BOQ as a roommate, and we were both about ready to get up.
I had just gone to the quarterdeck to relieve the watch as the petty officer of the watch. And at about 5 minutes to 8, the attack started. From my vantage point on the quarterdeck, I could see almost all of Ford Island. And I want to tell you, all of a sudden, everything started going up.
At 7:55 in the morning, Japanese dive bombers first hit the mine layer Oglala, then struck the cruiser Helena. The attack continued onward toward Battleship Row.
We got the word from a chief that the Japanese were bombing us. And everybody was, oops, wonder what's going to happen here. I know myself, I kind of played it cool and just wait until see what the other guys were going to do. Some of them started going down to the main deck, so I followed. When I got to the main deck, I saw where one of my co-workers was already had his machine gun already manned, shooting at some of the Japanese airplanes. Because you could see the pilot, and also I could see the torpedo on the plane. And it wasn't too long, he went out there and hit the stern of the battleship. And I could see where that thing had, just went up, and down. But then just about that time, we got hit, see? And Arizona got hit. I do want to say that our captain there, his name was Cason Young, and I was really proud of him. But while he was down, the Arizona, that's when it blew up, and he was blowing off the ship. And then he swam back and got back aboard, and then he told his people, he said, we're going to have to get underway.
Cason Young earned the Medal of Honor for his actions.
And my brother was on the ship, and he said, something's going on. I saw the red dots on the wings, so we saw the smoke rising, and we saw the planes buzzing around on Ford Island. So I ran as fast as I could, and I was yelling, the Japs are attacking, the Japs are attacking, as I ran down the gangway.
I was down in the fire room on a cold iron watch when the alarm sounded, and the guy came flying down the ladder. He slid down a lot of times, and I was grumbling about all the drills that they were having. And I'll never forget, he said, this is no regulation. The Oklahoma just turned over.
The first wave of the attack, I would just guess would be about 30 minutes to an hour, I don't know. There were 5 5-inch guns on our ship, and we were shooting as fast as we could, but I don't think they were very effective. And then there was a pause. And we knew that probably it was not over, but we tried to clear up the deck with all the empty shell cases, getting ready for another attack, and sure enough, they came. And the second attack came toward us. I was behind the mast there getting a shell case when I heard the gunner's mate say, "If anybody's ever prayed, now's the time." So I just briefly said in my mind, "Lord, forgive me my sins, because it looks like I'm about to come to meet you now." And at that very instant, there was a loud explosion, and it missed us off the fantail of our ship.
So things went into action very, very quickly. The general alarm, everybody manning their battle stations. You got to remember this was Sunday. A lot of guys were ashore on liberty. But we managed to get our guns to bear. And on the second wave, we gave them a pretty bad time. The Japanese torpedo planes carrying torpedoes had to fly as low as they could to the water. They have to run in the water a certain distance before they become armed. So their job was to get them in the water as quickly as possible so they could run the distance necessary to arm them. When they dropped down to that level, they were down level with the lifelines on my ship. And I'll tell you something, that's close. You could see the pilot, you could see the plane, he's right up on you. Well, a third-class torpedoman and me were manning 50 caliber machine guns amidships. And of course, we were shooting as much as we could. The fighter planes were strafing across our deck. And we kept shooting, and all of a sudden, the gun that I was on caught on fire. We found out later on that if I'd have fired 2 more rounds, the whole guts of that gun would have come out and went right back through me. So that shut us down with the machine guns. And so after that, of course, we went on out. The Utah was astern of us, and she was hit and was sinking.
Something hit us, and it went boom. And I got up, went to this porthole, and I could see the planes coming in. And how the Japs are attacking us. And I was going to run to my apartment and tell all my buddies, because a bunch of them still in bed. And I got about midship. Well, it was a bomb fell right in front of me, but it didn't go off. So I was laying on my stomach, and I didn't realize that it was water and oil was already on the deck, Got on top side, and the ship was just about straight up and down, And I jumped in the water, and this suction from the ship, that water was coming so fast, filling that ship up, that it was just like a vacuum on you, But I just kept fighting and finally I come to the surface.
As the men struggled to get ashore and fire back at their aggressors, other parts of the base were being assaulted as well. The air bases on Oahu also were targets for the Japanese surprise attack. Ford Island, Kanoe, Hickam, and Wheeler also felt enemy fire.
We looked out and we could see Japanese aircraft flying rooftop height, strafing the BOQ and the officers' quarters, which are right adjacent to us. Well, it didn't take long to see what was going on, and we got in our khakis, hailed a ride from the BOQ to the hangar area, and started moving aircraft and trying to protect them.
The Naval Air Base at Kaneohe also was a target.
The morning of the attack, I was plane captain on a ready plane, and my section leader, he and I were out, and we saw these planes coming in. And we were making snide remarks about, well, the Army's really flying on a weekend, And about that time they banked, and I remember him saying, my God, it's the Japs. And about that time, they were lined up on us and they started strafing, and so we ran this possibly world record speed to get back to the hangar in between the first and the second attack.
We went out and got the airplane running, but then the second wave of the attack came. This was a bombing wave, and a bomb landed nearby, and a seaplane full of holes, you don't try to fly it. It was hit, severely damaged, so we shut it down and headed back to the hangar as fast as we could go, and it was set on fire.
Wheeler Field was under attack as well.
We had been out the evening before, very late. It was Saturday night, and that's black tie night in the officers' clubs in Hawaii. And that leads to the fact that I was wearing a tuxedo pants in the morning, because the first thing that a young man does when he's awakened suddenly in the night is jump up and put his pants on, and I did. And I looked out thinking maybe it was the Navy, but it turned out to be the Japanese with coming right over my brand new car, which was parked outside the officers' club. And my friend George Welch, we were squadron mates, was there too. So I called my squadron out there and told them to arm up a couple airplanes and we'd be out. And we made a run through this strafing to my car. I could just imagine that car being torn up, and I hadn't paid for it yet. And anyway, off we went down the highway and made that 10 miles in probably 10 minutes. The airplanes were ready, so we jumped into the airplanes and took off. And by that time, the Japanese had departed. And we were just looking for where they were. And we noticed that there was a whole group of them over at Eva, which was a marine field. And so we just got into the stream of things there. We were flying together, side by side, and started up their chain of airplanes, and there were no match, so we knocked down quite a group of them there, and both of us ran out of ammunition. I headed back to Wheeler Field, and George had the same idea, and he was already back at Wheeler rearming. Wheeler Field in those days was just a big grass field. Didn't have runways, so I simply was able to head right toward them, and as a result, I could start shooting before my wheels left the ground. I pulled up, did a chandelle, and ended out on one's tail. So I was beginning to think that aerial combat was my bag, and I was doing quite nicely, and what I didn't know was I was in the middle of this line instead of in the end of it. I got a shot through my canopy and through my arm, and a little shrapnel in my tuxedo pants.
The attack came in two waves, the first at 7:55, the second at around 9 o'clock. In little more than 2 hours, the United States Navy was in ruins.
Our location was very, very near Battleship Row. And just before we got underway to get out of there, the Arizona had been hit with that big bomb that set her off and blew her up, and I have never witnessed an explosion like that in my life.
As we were going out of the harbor, it must have been around 11. That was one of the saddest things I've ever seen in my life. The first ship we passed was the Arizona, and it was spread open from front to aft. Tremendous blazes were coming from it, and there was a tremendous amount of heat as we passed by, and all of our battleships, all of them, were sunk. One of the old sailors was crying, one of the tough old sailors. He said, "This is the blackest day in the United States naval history."
I'll be frank with you, I don't think they had a dry tear man on that deck. And looking over there, we couldn't believe what we were seeing. We saw the Oklahoma tilted over. We saw the Arizona, by that time it was sunk. what we could see of it between the smoke and the fire was just the structure.
I went back to the Arizona and had boat hooks and we were pulling these guys out of the water. And most of them were already dead. They wasn't as dying and screaming. And water was burning out there, you know, the oil was burning and it just burned them up, you know. Well, I did that, seemed like for 2 hours. I don't know how long it was. And finally I got so sick I started vomiting. So they pulled me off of that.
It was a bad day all the way around. There was 5 or 6 feet of oil on the surface of that bay on fire. And it was pretty awful. When these explosions occurred, there was body parts all over the ships. This is hard to understand. And at the time when you're in it, you don't think about it. And afterwards, when you get a moment, pretty rough. And of course, we laugh a lot, but don't mean much.
Of course, everybody went back to their squadrons trying to prepare for what we thought would be another attack. And we didn't have very many airplanes to prepare. Virtually all of our first-class airplanes were destroyed.
In fact, the Navy lost 92 planes, while the Army had 96 aircraft destroyed.
Of course, tried to get things restored back to some near normalcy. And to begin with, we weren't sure where the Japanese might be invading us. We were able to put together 3 more aircraft by 5 o'clock that day by taking a tail from this one, an engine from that one, and we were able to get some aircraft in the air, but it was too late to do any good at all. Our squadron was very fortunate. I believe we had six injured out of the whole squadron. It is amazing because we were unprotected. We were not standing behind any walls or anything out there trying to move aircraft, and we had no helmets on. But after the attack was over, looking around, we could find shrapnel all over the place that had passed by us.
Our squadron, we had 1 man killed. No serious injuries, but we did have injuries. In fact, the fellow that went with me to start the airplane, he was injured in a delicate area of his body where he'd have to drop his pants and bend over to look at the scar. But nonetheless, he got a Purple Heart for it, and we made lots of jokes about it.
The damage the Japanese attack leveled on the United States Pacific Fleet was staggering. 6 battleships were sunk, 2 destroyers were gone. Heavy damages were inflicted upon other craft. Combined military forces lost more than 2,400 men, with numerous other casualties. Few military operations had such devastating results in such a short period of time. The news of the attack reached the mainland before the second wave of the Japanese attack occurred. Roosevelt gathered his advisors and chief congressional leaders, and he informed them that he would go to Congress the next day and ask for a formal declaration of war. Roosevelt did as he promised and went to Capitol Hill and addressed the Congress and the nation. His speech was short and immortal.
I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
Less than an hour later, Congress declared war on Japan.
Therefore be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled that the state of war between the United States and the Imperial Government of Japan, which has thus been thrust upon the United States, is hereby formally declared.
3 days later, Hitler honored the tripartite pact with Japan and declared war against the United States. Many historians see this move as Hitler's fatal flaw and a colossal military blunder, because America was now legitimately drawn into the war in Europe. Although America was determined to win the war, it was ill prepared to do so. The economy was still suffering the effects of the Depression. Unemployment was high and industrial production was low. But the United States moved from peacetime to wartime very quickly. Young men enlisted in the armed services. Farmers who were exempt from service began to produce food for the troops at home, as well as in Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Factories began wartime production, which employed millions.
And everybody wanted to do something for the United States. Even my folks, every one of them, they come from the farm in Nebraska and come out to Los Angeles and started in the aircraft factory. My mother, my sister, and my dad, and then my brother joined the Merchant Marine. So everybody got involved.
All of our massed effort is none too great to meet the demands of this war. We shall need everything that we have and everything that our allies have to defeat the Nazis and the fascists in the coming battles on the continent of Europe, and the Japanese on the continent of Asia and in the islands of the Pacific.
As more and more men entered the armed services, the demand for workers in factories brought women into the workforce as never before. The bombers and fighters that ruled the skies over the Pacific and Europe were almost entirely built by women. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had united America as never before. Americans stood united behind their president when he asked for their assistance.
Fellow Americans, I ask you to demonstrate again your faith in America by joining me in investing in the new defense savings bonds and stamps. And I know that you will help.
While the country began its preparations for war, the military faced the challenge of securing and cleaning up Pearl Harbor.
We started flying regular patrols around the islands to watch for any enemy action. We had ascertained that the Japanese were not around from patrols. We were able to get up in later days, and we were able to resume living in regular quarters after that. Replacement aircraft were sent over from the mainland, from other squadrons were also moved in to put us back in the state of readiness that we should be in.
In the meantime, one of the chiefs that I knew put me on the Arizona and Tennessee and a couple of the other ships to help him with his diving operations. And that's where you run into some pretty horrible things. I know when I was diving, helping them dive a little bit, I wasn't qualified, but I can dive. We had these great big 18-inch lines were pumping water out of the ships. We tried to clear all the compartments of people who were still in them. And every once in a while, you'd hear that pump. That meant another guy got away and went through the pumps. It's not good. It's pretty horrible.
The attack on Pearl Harbor catapulted the United States into World War II and changed the course of the war. The men and women who fought the war began to build their reputation as the greatest generation by setting the standard for dedication, honor, and valor. Unfortunately, the companion to the honor and valor of war is the horror of battle. The death of friends, the pain of the wounded, and the unseen wounds of remembering the incredible destruction wrought on the world. In hindsight, many a man has said, "You couldn't give me $1 million to do it again, but I wouldn't take $1 million for the experience." It's important to remember that the men who described the fight were boys on the brink of manhood.
I was born in September the 12th, 1923. So I just turned 18 years old. So that's 60 years of living with this. You know. Yeah. It's on your mind all the time. You know. Yeah. You stay pretty nervous. You know.
The whole situation is that psychologically it stays with you. I don't care what you do. Now, one of the reasons that you see these guys at conventions, they get in bunches together and they laugh and holler. They can't be alone. When you're alone, you get to thinking.
We must remember that the individual actions of simple men created these heroes. But if you ask them, they were just doing their job.
When I look at these guys and they come up and put their hands out to me, I see right through them and I see the station they were on. And I shake hands with a Marine who was on the Marine base, and I can see him racing down this road in an old Plymouth car, and the strafers after him, and he jumps out and runs across the ditch, gets in another car to get back to his airplane, to get up there where he can get killed. And you shake hands with a guy like that, you know?
The war in the Pacific required a different strategy than the war in Europe. There was no one landing that equaled the magnitude of Normandy. Instead, there were numerous smaller D-Days in which Allied forces faced an unseen, deeply entrenched enemy, the Japanese. While the United States was under attack by the Japanese fleet, Japanese aircraft and ground forces attacked Hong Kong, the British-controlled city in China. By Christmas Day, 12,000 British troops were forced to surrender. Japan moved with lightning efficiency on to other targets on their agenda: Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. Each new invasion brought with it another Japanese victory. Pearl Harbor would not be the only defeat that the Americans would endure in the early months of the war. The day after Pearl Harbor, Wake Island was attacked. This way station between Hawaii and the Philippines fell just before Christmas. Guam was attacked the same day as Wake Island. The small garrison of 500 Marines was no match for the 5,000 Japanese troops and fell in a few short hours.
We knew the Japanese were going to attack the Philippines. Our intelligence told us that the Japanese had no modern fighting plane that would be competitive to us. So our feeling was, well, let's get the war started and we'll clean them up quick and get home. In the very beginning, when the Japanese first attacked, it was supposed to be a coordinated attack, and the Philippines were supposed to be hit the same time that Pearl Harbor and Wake Island and Guam were hit, but nothing happened in the morning after we were alerted. We went out and took positions and got ready to attack, and nothing happened until about 11 or 12 o'clock when our planes were coming back to refuel, and the Japanese just cleaned out the Air Force on the ground, so that they lost all the brand new B-17s and all the fighter planes that would have helped escort us on our patrols. So we had no escorts at all, no protection, except our lumbering PBY-4s. We flew the PBY-4s made by Consolidated Corporation. These planes were obsolete at the time the war started. And we had 28 planes altogether at the beginning in the 2 squadrons. Within a week, we had lost over half of the planes. I remember one of the encounters that I personally had in one of our patrols. And our orders were to count the ships and identify them and see if they were underway or not. And we got halfway home when they were ordered to go back and recount them again. And of course, we knew at that time that probably they would be alerted, and suddenly the guns started to go off in back of our planes. And I can remember yelling back to the Brits, and I said, "What the hell are you guys doing back there?" We always cleared the guns to make sure they're working. I said, "Gee, what are they doing clearing the guns out here?" And with that, this beautiful silver plane came roaring past, not 30, 40 feet away. And there were 3 Japanese Zero fighter planes that attacked us that day. That sight of that beautiful Japanese silver plane at that speed was something unbelievable. It was the longest range fighter plane in the world at that time, and the most maneuverable fighter plane. In the beginning, it was a total slaughter.
On the Philippine Islands, the undermanned and undertrained Filipino forces also were no match for the veteran Japanese army, which pushed them up into the Bataan Peninsula. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. forces in the Philippines, abandoned the capital city of Manila and moved to the fortress island of Corregidor, where he awaited reinforcements. But the mighty U.S. fleet lay seriously wounded in the waters of Pearl Harbor, so no help was forthcoming. The combined forces held off the attack for 3 months. It took a personal order from President Roosevelt to force MacArthur to leave Corregidor. It was then that he, his family, and assistants fled to Australia on a PT boat. MacArthur pledged to return.
It wasn't at all what we had expected, and we felt very let down, and the morale in the squadron was very low. After all, if we did sight something, what could be done about it? We had nothing to strike back with. That you never figured your country would allow you to get that weak, that they would allow a country that we consider a third-rate country to completely knock us out of the ball game. We just couldn't bring ourselves to believe that that could ever happen. And this was the demoralizing factor. And we were very resentful about the Europe First part. And we knew then that there were no reinforcement.
In May of 1942, the remaining U.S. forces in the Philippines surrendered to the Japanese.
I was taken on the Bataan Peninsula, took part in the Bataan Death March. They marched us all day, wouldn't let us rest, didn't give us water, beat us constantly. They beat the devil out of us with rifle butts, sabers, and whatever. Still wouldn't give us water, still didn't give us rest, still didn't feed us. But it got to the point where we knew that we would die without water. So we would rush these artesian wells, and if you were lucky, you got a sip of water. If you were unlucky, you died from a Japanese bullet, because the guards would immediately open up on us, as we broke rank. And nobody knows exactly how many people died and were killed on the march. There are numbers as few as 800 and as many as 1,200. But those numbers are insignificant compared to the numbers that died in prison camp. To look back at the war and compare it to what prison life was like, the war was a picnic compared to the life as a prisoner.
So we went to Molamine, Burma, and they put us in a leper prison for a few days, and then they took us out to our first camp in building the railroad, 17 Kilo. And 17 Kilo, they had very poor water, and you got 1 canteen of water a day. Now, you could use it anytime you wanted to, but we started working out in the hot sun on the desert, on the railroad. And we moved to 80 Kilo, and that's when our people started really getting sick. We had dysentery, cholera, beriberi, and we all had malaria, but we did have quinine. And for ulcers, now like I had one here that I got stopped. A tropical ulcer would start out with a little red spot, and then a little white spot would get in the middle, and then it would start, and then the hole would just get bigger and bigger. And some of the guys had the whole bones of their legs showing before they died. The Japs showed us brutality, beatings. In other words, I guess that was their only entertainment, was us, and they didn't mind working us over. When they beat you, you couldn't fight back, but you figured, you looked at them and says, "You little son of a bitch, I can take everything you got," to yourself. You didn't say it out loud. And you said, "If I'm going down, you're going to knock me down. I'll be unconscious, and so I'll be here." And that's the way we whipped them, because they knew that we were Americans. By God, they knew. The year in Burma, we lost about a third of our people. We started out with 368, and like I say, 229 survived. In December of '43, the railroad's complete.
The stories of the Bataan Death March and the Burmese prison camps, compounded with the devastation on Pearl Harbor, helped to strengthen the American resolve against the Japanese.